Hey everyone, welcome to this week's subscriber question. This question comes from Juan's second time around, and this question actually comes from an Instagram supporter for once. Yes, I did ask on Instagram, and if you're not familiar with Instagram, if you didn't know that I have an Instagram, well, I do. I've actually been posting on there 5 to 7 times a week. So, something to consider if you want more added value from the channel. Of course, as you guys know, it's all free. With that said, Juan wants to know, how does insulin resistance impact weight gain and weight loss? And he specifically wanted to know more about the cellular aspects, which I really love questions like this because I love talking about the cellular aspects, really digging deep. So insulin resistance, if you're not familiar, is usually attributed to what's called type 2 diabetes. And of course you can argue for other aspects as well, but for the most part it's attributed to type 2 diabetes. So with that said, what does that exactly mean? Well, that means that your pancreas is releasing insulin, but your cells are insensitive to that insulin. So the way that it typically works is when you ingest carbohydrates and they get absorbed into your bloodstream, your cells attach to insulin, or more like insulin attaches to your cells using insulin receptors that are on the very edge, on the very membrane of each cell. And what that does is it leads to a cascade, and that cascade will then lead to a translocation of what's called a GLUT4 transporter. So GLUT4 will then embed itself into the membrane of the cells, and then glucose, carbohydrates, can then shuttle into the cell, so allowing the cell to then feed itself and taking glucose outside of the blood serum, which is good because then your blood glucose levels go from high and start diminishing back down to where they should be. Now in an insulin insensitive situation, well, of course, then you have insulin that binds to those receptors, but you're not getting as many of those GLUT4 receptors or transporters that are allowing glucose in. So that's kind of an issue because it maintains your insulin levels keep going higher and higher and higher as your pancreas keeps cranking out insulin because you're not getting as much of a reaction. And of course, your blood glucose levels are also staying relatively high. And eventually at a certain point, you become what's called diagnosed as type 2 diabetic. So how does that impact weight loss and weight gain? Well, in a cellular aspect, when you have that translocation, that cascade that occurs when insulin binds to the receptor, what's actually happening is it's going through what's called an AKT-mediated system, or AKT-mediated cascade. So you have a bunch of different proteins that get activated until it leads to a particular protein that's very, very famous when it comes to the insulin cascade called AKT. It's also known as protein kinase B. And that will actually lead to this further translocation of this GLUT4. So when you're insulin insensitive, the issue with that is that you're not getting as much GLUT4, as I mentioned that. In terms of weight loss and weight gain, it makes things really tricky. There are other ways of getting glucose into the cells, but in terms of actually changing weight, it can make things really tricky, especially if you want to try and gain muscle. Having less sensitivity there leads to less glucose being able to enter the cells. And if you've got less glucose, you've got a less metabolically rich environment, so you're not able to go through glycolysis, you're not able to go through aerobic glycolysis specifically and not go into the mitochondria and start creating more ATP. So in that situation, then kind of downstream, and this is really downstream at this point, you're not getting as much of an action of mTOR, and then you're not getting as much protein synthetic response. And a quick side note here, if you haven't checked out my protein synthesis article and video, that discusses how mTOR is activated, and I put a ton of work into it. I keep plugging into these videos because frankly, I really did put a ton of work into it. So check that out if you want to know more about mTOR and protein synthesis. But on the other side, how can it impact weight loss? So how can you lose weight? Well, that's tough too, and insulin insensitivity can have an impact. That doesn't mean that you can't lose weight when you're insulin insensitive. You absolutely can. But if you have less of that translocation of GLUT4, you're taking in less from the bloodstream. So what does that mean? You've got more blood glucose in that serum, meaning you've got less being fed to the cells. So again, you have this kind of repeated feedback cycle. Pancreas pumping out insulin, you keep ingesting carbohydrates, or you keep ingesting calories in general, and your blood glucose levels keep staying high because you're not getting enough of that GLUT4 translocation. So your cells are starving. They're not eating enough. They're not consuming enough nutrients through glucose. So what's happening to that glucose? It's not just staying in serum. Well, it kind of is, but it's also leading to what's called glycation. Glycation is when you have these blood glucose molecules that attach to red blood cells, and they essentially kind of coat the red blood cells. And if you ever go check your HA1C, which is a blood glucose marker that tells you kind of where your blood glucose was over a month, 3 to 4 weeks, then that'll give you a good idea of where your glycation levels are. You're going to have a little bit always, but having too much can lead to, again, diabetes, or at least it's going to be a strong indicator of diabetes. So insulin insensitivity, does it have an impact on weight loss and weight gain? Absolutely it does, especially in muscle gain and trying to expunge and get rid of a lot of that glucose that's found in your system. But is it impossible? No, absolutely not. Losing weight absolutely increases your insulin sensitivity, so it'll make you better. And of course, exercise can mediate through other pathways independent of that AKT system, AKT cascade, and can also lead to the ingestion of glucose into the cells and really help you lose weight in that way as well. So, hopefully I answered the question, Juan. I know that was very cellular, and maybe I lost a few of you guys out there, but it is really interesting stuff. And of course, I'd be happy to clarify some of what I've said. You know, this is all an education channel. We're trying to learn here, and I would be happy to help you really understand how these cascades work and how insulin insensitivity can impact. So feel free to comment below. And with that said, I will see you guys in the very next video. Have an awesome day. See ya.